Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Susan Call, and on behalf of our owners and our entire staff, I'd like to welcome you to Politics and Prose this evening. Before we get started, just a reminder to please turn off or silence your cell phones. Also, during the question and answer session, we have one microphone this evening right over here. If you could please step up to ask your question, we'd be grateful because we are recording this event. Also, after the event, if you don't mind helping us by folding your chairs, we'd be grateful. If you haven't already picked up one of our calendars, please pick one up at the information desk and take a look at all of the classes, trips, and events we have going on this month. Also come visit us at Busboys and Poets. We've just opened our first satellite location in Brookland, and we'll be at Tacoma Park next month. I'm very pleased to welcome Julian Zelizer this evening to talk about his new, incredibly timely book, The Fierce Urgency of Now, which is an analysis of how Lyndon Johnson single-handedly achieved the historic legislative successes of the mid-1960s. Professor Zelizer looks back at the Johnson years and offers a compelling case that previous accounts of Johnson's role may have been somewhat exaggerated or at least slightly off base. That this book should coincide with controversies surrounding the accuracy of the new movie Selma suggests there's room for a deeper and less sentimental view of the Great Society and all the characters who played a role in it, most notably Johnson. Professor Zelizer teaches at Princeton University, and he's a fellow at the New America Foundation. He's the author of 6 previous books, including An Arsenal of Democracy and Jimmy Carter, and he's also a columnist for CNN.com. Please help me welcome Professor Zelizer back to Politics and Prose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's terrific to be here. It's terrific to be talking about the book. This is one of my favorite bookstores, so it's a pleasure to be part of it, and thanks to all of you for coming. This book is in the news, in part because of the film in Selma, but the other issue is simply Lyndon Johnson and the comparison to President Obama, which has been a frequent part of the debate over the current presidency. Since the start of his presidency, there have been many critics who have often talked about the need for President Obama to be more like Lyndon Johnson, to twist more arms, to schmooze a little more, to be willing to engage in the kind of hardball politics that seems to be necessary to make Washington work. Part of this is not simply about the current president. I think it's about a yearning for political leaders who can make a Washington that seems to be gridlocked and dysfunctional work. The need for President Obama to be more like Lyndon Johnson is extraordinarily popular among Washington insiders, for sure. There was a story when President Obama's health care bill was floating and being debated that some staffers handed out a copy of Robert Caro's book to fellow Democrats in the Senate, saying, why can't our president do more of this? And what was the secret of Lyndon Johnson that got his legislation through the upper chamber? Maureen Dowd of the New York Times wrote that Obama is the anti-Lyndon Johnson in a column that tried to characterize the differences between the two of them. The book that I've written is a narrative history of the Great Society. It moves from the period when President Kennedy is in the White House, when commentators then talked, like today, about a dysfunctional Congress, a Congress that was gridlocked. Then the problem was a coalition of Southern Democrats and Republicans, rather than just the Republican Party. And when Congress was failing to deal with all the major issues of the time. It moves through the transformative years between 1964 and 66, when Congress passed a huge amount of legislation that today seems almost impossible. Medicare, Medicaid, voting rights, civil rights, the war on poverty, immigration reform, environmental regulation, federal aid for education in elementary schools, in higher education, smaller bills like the safety caps on medicine to prevent children from getting access to pills, to the labeling of cigarette products, to food stamps, to much, much more. And it goes through how that happened and what happened here in Washington and the relationship between liberal activists, Congress, and the White House that allowed it to take place. And then the book moves through the final years of Johnson's presidency between 1966 and 1968, when Johnson has a very troubling and difficult period, when all of his magic doesn't work and when there's a conservative backlash in Congress against much of what he's done, at the same time the Democrats fray over the war in Vietnam. That's the story. Part of the argument of the book, part of what I'm trying to do, is to challenge some of our assumptions that Lyndon Johnson's success came primarily from him. To challenge the idea that the story of these years was simply about a legislative political wizard, a political magician who knew how to do what no one else can do. And I wanted to put Lyndon Johnson, who was a very skilled politician, in some kind of context, to understand what was it about the Congress of the time, what was it about the country at that time that allowed someone like Lyndon Johnson to succeed. And that's the story of the book. And the iconic image of Lyndon Johnson, as many of you who knew him or who saw him or who have read about him is the treatment. And that's where Johnson would physically hover over both his opponents and his supporters. There's a classic picture with Richard Russell, his mentor in the Senate, a conservative Southerner, where he's standing over him and Russell's looking up. Or another with Senator Theodore Green, which captures the same kind of image. And that, in some ways, is how we think of what happened at the period. But I wanted to move beyond that. And I wanted to really try to understand what was going on, what was making Washington work for those years, and why did that shut down. So part of the story I tell is about social movements, and something that certainly historians have written a lot about, like my friend Michael Kazin in the back. The impact that social movements had in that period was immense. Part of why the Congress that Joseph Clark, a senator, a liberal senator from Pennsylvania, called the sapless branch of government, part of what made it change was the immense pressure that was building by 1963 and 1964 on both the executive branch and Congress to take action. Liberalism at that time was very vibrant. Part of it was what's captured in the movie Selma, the actual grassroots activists who went to the streets and who tried to pressure and force politicians to do what they often didn't have the courage to do at that moment. Part of it were interest groups like the AFL-CIO, a huge force at the time representing organized labor, which not only mobilized its members behind bills, but organized in Washington and lobbied behind bills. When the Congress, when the House would be voting on a measure, this was a period when things weren't recorded. So you didn't even know how most members actually voted on an issue. So organized labor would put their people in the galleries with civil rights activists to literally watch over the Congress. They were called gallery vultures to see what they were doing. And what was amazing were liberal organization this period had immense, not just clout, but access on Capitol Hill. There was an ecosystem of liberalism, which doesn't exist today, which was quite important to the story of building pressure on Congress by 1964. And so there's a lot of examples in the story of how this worked. The March on Selma is a very important example of this. Lyndon Johnson, unlike the depiction in the movie, and I could talk about this later, was fully in favor of voting rights. The administration was working on a bill and negotiating with the Senate, but he wasn't prepared to send the bill to Congress yet. He was scared in January of 65 that he didn't have all the power everyone said he did. And if he did that too soon, that this bill was going to fall apart. And part of what the movement did in Selma, part of what King, the legislative strategist, does, is to build that pressure through the protests, through the images, through the confrontation.